Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 21 today, after King David has acceded to the demands of the Gibeonites to turn over 7 of the sons of Saul to remedy the blood guilt that David has heard from Yahweh lies on the land and has caused a famine, because Saul had killed some of the Gibeonites during a time that there was a treaty between them and the Israelites. But as we looked at last time, it was much more complicated than that about who the Gibeonites were. And so if you haven't watched the last video, I encourage you to do that. Today, the theme moves away from the question of the Gibeonites to the theme of Saul's women and the family. And we're going to see the amazing, courageous witness of Rizpah, who will throw herself on the rock to protect the dead bodies of her sons for several months, all alone. It's an amazing scene. And the fact that the Deuteronomistic historical writers put this in there almost certainly several centuries after the time of the actual reign of David really says something about what they thought the role of kings were and the role of women and their witness. So that's one of the things we want to look at today. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been looking at this chiastic shape that almost all scholars acknowledge in these closing chapters. If you haven't watched the introductory video where I explain some of the evidence for why we can really assume that this is from a much later time, from the time of King Josiah, perhaps in the 630s when Deuteronomy and Joshua were written, or perhaps from a much later time. And we'll also see some of that today in the relationship with Saul's family and some of the other details that we'll see. So the chiasm pairs the scene we're seeing today with the scene at the very end, and both of them end with the issue of Yahweh giving in and giving up having some kind of problem with the people. It was anger at David in chapter 21 and the famine, as we'll see here. You can see the anger down there. And we also note the two chiastic paired psalms that David writes there. In the purple in 22 and 23, and the two lists of warriors there. And at the center is the last words of David. So we've been looking at our immediate story here where there isn't a particular chiasm here, and we ended here just before these verses here, and we'll continue that all the way through this section. And as we do, it's important to look some at the geography, because Gibeon is here, and Gibeah is Saul's place, and Jerusalem is right there. And one of the issues is where this takes place. We see, as you can see on the left side of the screen, the vaguely described mountain on the mountain before Yahweh. But is that Mount Gilboa, where Saul and Jonathan died? We'll have to look at how this story evokes both the song of the bow that David intoned over Jonathan and Saul at the beginning of 2 Samuel, but also the song that's coming up in chapter 22 is also parallel with Psalm 18. So as we enter into this here, let's note that we get a lot of information. And if I put the shape back up so we can see this, there are 8 names here in these immediate verses. The 2 sons of Rizpah, daughter of A, whom she bore to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merab, daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai the Mahelathite. There's a lot going on there. And to unpack that, let's go back for a moment and just look over Saul's children and family reports. Because one of the things at issue here is who is Rizpah and who is she in relation to Saul, and why will David, as we'll find out in a few verses, respond so powerfully to her witness. So this is color-coded, so you see the males in blue and the females in the dark red here. And let's go over the whole thing because I think it's important for you to understand what's at issue with who's being offered here and what that says to the audience. So we saw in the beginning in 1 Samuel 14, as you can see there, these 3 named sons of Saul. Jonathan, Ishvi, who we never hear about again, and Malchishua here, who is also listed in this other list in 1 Chronicles, and also at the end of 1 Samuel, as you see here. But for whatever reason, Ishvi falls out and is replaced by Abinadab, who was described earlier as the son of Jesse, one of David's brothers. So whatever is going on there, Ishvi and Abinadab don't seem relevant. And in any event, they all are said to have died in this battle here at the same time that Saul and Jonathan died. So they were apparently all dead there. So when we get to the question of the Gibeonites asking for Saul's sons, well, what sons are we asking for? Let's look a little further at this list before we look more closely at our text. So then we hear at that time when Saul's daughter Merab should have been given to David. Notice much like Saul gave David his daughter Michal and then took her away, and then David got her back for 200 foreskins, but she never had a child with him because she was jealous of David unclothing himself in the street before the girls of the street. So David did not have what would be an embarrassing grandson of Saul, who would be a part of both houses. That never happened. But here we see that Saul's daughter Merab, who would have been given to David, is given to Adriel the Mahelathite, who we see in our passage on the left side as the father of the 5 children of Merab, who we know nothing further about. Then we know about Saul's son Jonathan's crippled son Mephibosheth, and we followed his story throughout 2 Samuel, both David taking him in and having him at the royal table, as we also hear to the final king taken into the Babylonian table at the end of 2 Kings, but also the dispute with Ziba over the land during the Absalom rebellion that was resolved on the return when David decided to split the land between them. And so we saw in the previous verse 7, our immediate passage, that David spared Mephibosheth for the sake of his oath with Jonathan back in 1 Samuel 20. So those sons are out of the way. But now we hear Saul had a secondary woman whose name was Rizpah, daughter of Ai. And I translate secondary woman, as many feminist scholars have taught us to do, translating the Hebrew word pilagesh, which is traditionally understood as concubine. And concubine certainly is a pejorative sort of word, and secondary woman or secondary wife highlights it. This is perhaps in status not as high as the others, but equally important. And in fact, it's her children here who are at issue. So she's not treated any lesser. And she was the one, Saul's man Abner went in that pissed off Ishbaal, who ended up dying, as we saw back here. We didn't look at that scene, but Abner had gone into Rizpah here, and we don't know if it actually happened, but that's what Ishbaal accused him of, and that's where Abner said, "You're useless, Ishbaal," and he ends up getting killed in his bed. So the only other thing we know about Rizpah is that she may well have been raped, is the only way to put it, by Saul's general Abner before this. And then we hear about Michal, the daughter of Saul, who had no child, and then we get to our immediate scene. So putting back up the key words here and looking at our scene, let's note what's being said. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, daughter of A. So in other words, these are all Saul's grandsons. These are not his sons. His sons are dead. And so this is 2 generations removed from what would apparently be the blood guilt of what's going on. We don't know if these are children, and we don't really know when this story is supposed to be taking place. As I was indicating in the introductory video and last time, it certainly can't be taking place in the chronology that we see after the Absalom rebellion, etc., because it's many years after Saul, and if this is blood guilt for something Saul did in his lifetime, why would there be a famine only at this late date? So these stories are written much later. It's projecting back into some time earlier in David's reign. And so these children almost certainly be children at that time, not adult children. So it's really child sacrifice that's being offered here, supposedly to assuage Yahweh. And we have to really think about what that's saying about David's theology here. He's doing this because he understands, and as we'll see wrongly, that this is what Yahweh demands in order to remove the blood guilt that's causing the famine. But does that fit any kind of theology of Yahweh that we know about? If the blood guilt is because Saul has killed people, the Israelites made a treaty not to kill, so that Yahweh is rightfully upset over deaths that didn't need to happen, why would the way to remedy that be deaths of 7 obviously innocent children? But David seems to accept that idea that child sacrifice is what's necessary, but it's not what's necessary, as we'll see. It's Rizpah's bold witness that will assuage Yahweh in the end. Laws in the book of Deuteronomy. And although I've been noting throughout the stories of Samuel and Saul and David that these texts are written long before the book of Deuteronomy and roughly in the time of Josiah, these stories in 2 Samuel 21 and 24 were not. So the audience of these stories from the beginning would know these passages from Deuteronomy. Let's look back at that just for a moment to look at Deuteronomy 24:16, where we hear, "Parents shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their parents. Only for their own crimes may persons be put to death." In other words, under that law, what David is doing here is against the Torah. And the other law, which is not addressed directly here in 21:22 to 23, is when someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You shall bury him the same day, for anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land that Yahweh your God is giving you for possession. So Rizpah's witness, assuming she took them down from they're being hanged there, solves that problem, but they're not put in the grave until the end of our story, as we'll see. So the audience knows that the situation violates both those Deuteronomistic laws, and whether Yahweh wants those or not before that, these laws make clear that's against Yahweh's will. So these are the grandchildren. So we hear Armoni is taken, the son of Rizpah, Mephibosheth not. So when she has her witness, it's really only one of her sons at issue, and the 5 sons of Merab, daughter of Saul. We don't hear their names. Interestingly, we hear the name of Rizpah's sons. We don't hear the names of Merab's sons. Nor do we hear about Merab having any concern with the loss of her sons. Is she simply afraid? Perhaps she's dead. We know nothing more about her. So now the king took them and gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they impaled them on the mountain. As Will Gaffney notes, lynched them would be a good translation, noting the root meaning to hang or dislocate or impale. We noticed last time, as Falcoman had noted, the word doesn't have enough instances in the Hebrew Bible to be sure of what it means, but certainly Gaffney's right there to associate that with lynching. And as she also notes that in womanist theology, as she represents, Rizpah is often the subject of many sermons for her bold witness in the face of this male violence. So, as I know, they impaled him on the mountain without saying what mountain. As Clement, who, as I noted last time, has dissertation on these chapters and is very helpful, notes the contrast with Jerusalem and the chiastic pair, which is to say with chapter 24, which ends with David buying the threshing floor that will become the basis for the temple and assuages Yahweh there. So he says, quote, "It is Jerusalem and not the mountain of God in Gibeon, which is the place ordained by Yahweh for the king to draw near to him." But we don't know for sure that this is the mountain. We saw last time that the Gibeonites demanded that the children be killed on the mountain that was Saul's mountain, which would be Gilboa, where he was killed. And you can see it here, really just a ridge. So whether it's actually Gilboa or not, we don't know. But it certainly seems to be the mountain that's relevant to the Gibeonites and Gibeah, where Saul was, and certainly not Jerusalem. And literally before the Lord are in the face of Yahweh. And we can only imagine what Yahweh's face experiences with the death of these innocent children. The 7 of them perished not just together, but as one. And just to emphasize that, they were put to death in the first days of harvest, at the beginning of barley harvest. And beginning here in the Hebrew is double for emphasis. The beginning, yes, the beginning of barley harvest, which is usually a time of great celebration. As you can see, as my note below, reference in the book of Ruth, associated with Passover, as barley is the first spring grain in Israel, and so it's acknowledging the end of winter and the beginning of a feeding season. But as Falcoman notes, this barley harvest is, as it were, vacuous, because the land still groans under the regimen of the chronic drought, 3 years into the famine here. So it's recognizing this as a time of springtime, but in the absence of food, it's a very dry harvest. And then we hear this amazing scene, and it's only one verse, but I really want to highlight what kind of theological imagination did it take for the authors, almost certainly writing hundreds of years after the time of David, to insert this story here. Then Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, of whom we know nothing, but as several scholars have noted, for her to become the secondary woman for Saul the king, she had to be somebody important, but we know nothing about Aiah, took sackcloth, and one of the only times we hear about it in the book of Samuel. It's also the word for just sack. That makes sense, that the sack is made of the sackcloth, and spread it on a rock for herself, or literally on the rock. We don't know exactly what rock, presumably the rock at the base of the mountain, from the beginning of the harvest until rain fell on them from the heavens, or from the sky, which is even the beginning of spring, all the way through spring and all the way through summer, when the fall rains would come, being there by herself for months. It's hard to imagine, and people must have brought her some food, or there must have been some respite, but nothing is described. The phrase for the rain fell on them from the heavens, literally, as Falcom notes, water poured itself out over them from heaven, or literally from the sky waters, noting the play on words that we hear back in Genesis, with Mayim as water and Shamayim as the sky water, or the heavens, if you will. And so this long, lonely vigil over these dead bodies. And the narrator goes on to explain what's at issue. She did not allow the birds of the air to come on the bodies, although on the bodies is not in Hebrew, so I have it more properly on this side. She would not allow the birds of the air to settle by day, or the wild animals by night. And what kind of energy does that take? To sit there all day, every single day. There's no way she can take a break, or those bodies would be eaten up by the birds or by the animals. It's really an amazing, amazing story. And then somehow David is told about it. And certainly, if this is taking place for months, it must have become legendary, and yet nobody is reported to help her. And again, where is Merab? Merab could have been in solidarity with her sister here, the other mother of Saul's grandsons, and the other person whose children have been killed here, but she's nowhere in sight. Rizpah's all by herself. And so we don't know who David was told by, but it certainly indicates that people know, and nobody stopped to help her at all. And as my note below has, her unexpected and bold action will inspires David to follow up in a royal way. Concubine here is Pilagesh, as I noted earlier, and we don't need to hear it that way. So we hear this response directly from David. And as my note below has, the war with the house of Saul is now finally over, and the relics can be returned to their ancestral home, and that's what we'll see. And notice in these 3 verses, overflowing with the 3 repeated elements, son Jonathan 3 times, bones 6 times, and Saul 4 times, as you can see over here. And so David went and took the bones of Saul, and we saw bones earlier, especially in 5:1, when the people of Israel come to him after he's king over Judah and say, "Are we not your bone and flesh?" As a means of saying we're family and reign over us. But now they're simply bones with no flesh. Bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the people of Jabesh Gilead. And interestingly, the writer here says it was stolen from the public square. But it wasn't anything like that at the time. Let's go back and look at it, where they were honored as heroes. When the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done with Saul, which is to say to hang up their bodies in humiliation, all the valiant men set out, traveling all night long, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his son from the wall of Bethshan. They came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took the bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. And notice those are the final words of the book of 1 Samuel. And that certainly seems to be an honorary thing, that they prevent the bodies from just being there humiliated, much perhaps like Nicodemus and Joseph and Arimathea taking Jesus' body off the cross and burying them in their own tomb. And yet, in our immediate passage, it's described with the word stolen, and as if they were bad, as if David is rescuing them from a place where they've been stolen, which makes you wonder, if that's such a bad place, why has it taken so long to do that? But we don't hear about that. And we hear the report back to where the Philistines had hung them up, doubled there to emphasis, on the day the Philistines killed Saul on Gilboa. And that reference links us back to what's called the Song of the Bow, which is the song that David sings over the dead bodies of Saul and Jonathan at the very beginning of 2 Samuel, as you can see here. And notice the connections here. So he ordered the Song of the Bow, using the word Quesheth. That's only in the song that we see in the very next chapter, elsewhere in 2 Samuel. And as I was noting in the introductory video, many scholars have connected Hannah's song in the beginning of 1 Samuel and David's song in the end of 2 Samuel, and this song at the centerpiece as the 3 pillars that hold up the entire book. And I will note, as I noted in the introductory video, that chapter 22 has many late words that really highlight how, like many of the Psalms, it was written much later. So does this song, and I didn't highlight that at the time, and so does Hannah's song. So it may well be that all 3 songs were added later when these chapters were added, chapter 21 to 24, but we don't know that. But notice the connections. The Song of the Bow, the question of the mighty have fallen, that's several times in here, but it's also 5 times in the warrior list in chapter 23 and also in the Psalm. The references to Gilboa, and it's only in our immediate passage here on the left side, after this, in the entire book of 2 Samuel. The issue of the shield of Saul, which is only in the other song at the end in the next chapter we see here, twice immediately here. And then the issue of distressed only in the end, where David is distressed at the very end in the parallel with chapter 21. So many ways in which this song about Saul and Jonathan is parallel. But we won't go back over it now because I have videos on it at the time. But notice how it's also propaganda, like we'll see the one in chapter 22. Saul and Jonathan, life and death, they were not divided. Well, Saul had sworn horribly about Jonathan in terrible words because he saw he was a betrayer and had sided with David. So this is a kind of after-the-fact propaganda that you can remember if you didn't have the rest of the book to remind you that it's only part of the story. So to continue to finish our scene here, he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who've been impaled. But notice it doesn't say that the bones of the grandsons were buried in the same tomb. They buried the sons of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin, in Zelah, which you only see in Joshua, one of the several elements in this chapter that connect us with Joshua and highlight the later addition of these chapters, in the tomb of his father Kish. Again, it doesn't mention the others. It highlights he gathered all the bones, the 7 who'd just been killed, and Saul and Jonathan, but it specifically highlights that he buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in Zelah and not the others. And after that, God heeded the supplications for the land. And as Gaffney adds beautifully, lynching Rizpah's and Merib's sons did not heal the land or the people. Doing right by a multiply wronged woman did. Sermons about Rizpah are not unheard of in black churches. She has a following among womanist preachers who remember, lament, and are strengthened by her strength. And the word for heeding the supplications here, which is hard to pronounce without the vowels, thr there, as a verb to supplicate, is only in the very last verse of 2 Samuel in the chiastic parallel, highlighting that both these stories are about what does it take for God to let go of the curses or bad things that God is doing. In this case, it was not to kill 7 innocent young men, but it was to witness to their death, even at the risk of your own life and your own suffering that Rizpah did. So may we remember Rizpah as the woman who convinced David to take the bones of his opponent and give them a proper burial. And with that, the reign of the family of Saul has come to a complete end. And the text will continue with the story of giant killers. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.